I'd like to call this meeting for the workshop meeting of the Board of Directors of the Vallecitos Water District, Thursday, August 29th at 5 p.m. Pledge of Allegiance. Would Director Eltharp, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Ready to begin. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And if we'll do a roll call on our little electric gizmos. It looks like we're all here. Okay, we're all here. Thank you. This is a workshop, so there is still public comment, and anyone wishing to address a matter not on the agenda may be heard at this time. However, no action will be taken until the matter is placed on a future agenda. Yeah. In accordance with board policy. Public comments are limited to 3 minutes. A request to speak form is required to be submitted, and the board is not permitted during this time to enter into a dialogue with the speaker. We have one person, Michael Hunsaker.
Michael Hunsaker, President of Twin Oaks Valley Property Owners Association. There's been some discussion about doing some groundwater storage, and indeed the EWA is counting on this as part of its program to convert some wastewater into reclaimed water or recycled water. Groundwater storage and capacity has got a checkered history in our county and city in particular. We have been a farmland community for some time. The groundwater is heavily laden with fertilizers, but more than that, wells have consistently failed in the area because of limited capacity. The use of groundwater underneath San Marcos is not reliable. History says it is very limited in capacity. And this would pretty much obliterate any chance of using it as part of some EWA and North County effort to do water reclamation or water recycling utilizing this questionable ground security. If reliability is an issue, this is not a viable option. Thank you.
Thank you. That's the end of public comment. Okay, items for discussion, modification of water and wastewater capital facility fees. And I will turn it over to our general manager.
Thank you, President Martin. So the item before you is a discussion on the capital facility fees. We'll call them cap fees from time to time, just so you know what we're talking about there. This item was discussed at the August 7th board meeting, and at that meeting the board did direct that the item be continued to the October 2nd board meeting and that a workshop be held, and tonight is that workshop that was asked for by the board. Just as a matter of record, we have received 2 letters from Mr. Scaglione. The board has a copy of those. They've been previously provided via email. The board has paper copies of them now. We won't go over those items in detail, but they will become part of the public record, just so the board understands that. So staff is still in the process of working on the final cap fees. We're taking information that we received at the last board meeting and other information we've received, and we're working with legal counsel. So tonight you're not going to hear specific numbers. You're not going to hear a specific dollar amount for a cap fee. But you will be hearing quite a few things. And one is you're going to hear about the legal issues. You're going to hear about the capital program and the master plan and how it drives out cap fees. You're going to hear about the methodology that we use to calculate the fee, which is really the crux of where we're heading, is what costs are included, what costs aren't included, which developers pay, and which ones don't. And then you're going to hear about the schedule for adoption. As I mentioned, the October 2nd is the date that we're scheduled to consider the capital facility fees in formal fashion. So that's our target right now, and absent hearing anything that delays that schedule, October 2nd will be coming forward to the board. So right now I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Lutfi Karuf from Best Best and Krieger. He's going to walk the board through the legal framework and the legal considerations that we have to think about before we adopt a fee.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the board. As Mr. Pruitt mentioned, I'm going to talk about some of the legal issues that that are applicable to the adoption of capacity fees and charges as a sort of way of introducing the mechanical discussion that will come a little bit later. So what are capacity charges, capital facility fees? These are charges capacity charges for purposes of applicable law, and they're subject to a number of bodies of law. The first is Proposition 13, which we're not going to discuss in detail today just because it's not the most directly applicable. The second is Government Code Section 66013. This is a specific portion of the Mitigation Fee Act. And the third is California Constitution Article 13C, Section 1E. That's part of the Constitution that was added by the voters in 2010 as a part of Proposition 26. So the first portion I want to talk about is Government Code Section 66013. This is a small portion of the Mitigation Fee Act that's applicable specifically to capacity charges. The Mitigation Fee Act is a larger body of law that was adopted for the purpose of regulating how development impact fees may be adopted. However, those provisions are not applicable to capacity charges except for this one particular statute. So pursuant to 66013, when a local agency such as Vallecitos Water District wishes to impose a capacity charge, the government code restricts those charges from exceeding the estimated reasonable cost of providing the service for which the fee or charge is imposed. In other words, for capacity charges, that would be the cost of capacity in the system. In addition, the government code defines what a capacity charge is. It's a charge for public facilities that were either in existence at the time the charge is imposed or charges for new public facilities that must be acquired or constructed in the future that are of proportional benefit to that person or property being charged. So in other words, the government code allows capacity charges to be adopted that would collect the proportional share of the infrastructure you already have in the system that's been oversized to accommodate future growth. You can also use capacity charges to pay for new construction in the future, for example, new reservoirs or storage tanks or otherwise. As I mentioned earlier, capacity charges are not subject to the other provisions of the Mitigation Fee Act besides the procedural requirements for adopting capacity charges, which are set forth in 66016, and which the district is planning to or will be complying with on October 2nd. As well as sections 66022 and 66023, which have to do with establishing the statute of limitations for challenging capacity charges, as well as procedures for legal actions and audits of capacity charge revenue. So more specifically, the nexus findings that are typically required for development impact fees are not required for capacity charges. These are the sorts of things where you'd have to actually have a report that sets forth a nexus between the particular project and the development, the amount that's charged and the development, and so on. We still have to establish that capacity charges do not exceed the reasonable estimated cost of service or cost of capacity on a proportional basis, but those nexus findings that are required for development impact fees don't need to be made formally for capacity charges. So in addition to the government code provisions, we also have Proposition 26. This again was a voter initiative adopted in 2010. What Proposition 26 does is it says essentially that any fee or charge that's imposed by a public agency is a tax that requires voter approval unless it meets a specific exemption. Capacity charges will be exempt from the definition of a tax under the second exception in the Constitution, which is for a charge imposed for a specific government service or product that's provided directly to the payor, that is not provided to those not charged, and which does not exceed the reasonable cost to the local government of providing that service or product. So again, it's the same sort of limitation as we had under the government code. It essentially says that you can charge a capacity charge. It just has to be for a specific cost associated with that particular payor, and that's of a proportional value. There are a few important cases that I wanted to mention that talk about how these provisions are applied to capacity charges. The first one I want to mention is Richmond versus Shasta Community Services District. In this case, the Shasta Community Services District had a number of capacity charges. They had a fire suppression charge and another sort of meter connection charge that were challenged as violating Proposition 218 and all sorts of other laws. One of the arguments that was made is that these capacity charges are actually development impact fees, and so they have to comply with the entirety of the Mitigation Fee Act. In that case, the court said, no, they're not. They're only capacity charges. They have very specific authority that regulates them. Similarly, an earlier case, Capistrano Beach Water District versus Taj Development Corporation, it was a similar issue in that case. And again, the court said capacity charges are different from development impact fees and are not subject to the same legal requirements. The relevance of these cases, of course, is that what we're talking about today is what are the legal requirements for capacity charges, and where there is discussion of legal requirements for development impact fees, such as those nexus findings and otherwise, and reporting and auditing requirements, those are not applicable to capacity charges. So it's more just for the purpose of clarifying what the applicable law is. Finally, capacity charges are important because they allow a mechanism for agencies to make sure that growth pays for growth. This was addressed in the case of Chappelle Industries Incorporated versus Governing Board. And essentially what the court found there is that while it's fair that the public at large should not shoulder the cost of growth, the converse is also true, that developers should not be required to shoulder the entire burden of financing public facilities for future users. So therefore, when you're establishing capacity fees or otherwise, you have to show that a valid method was used to arrive at the fee in question that establishes a reasonable relationship between the fee charged and the burden posed by the development. So again, what this case kind of goes to is the same sorts of requirements that were set forth in the government code as well as in Prop 26. It's just that capacity charges can shift the cost of growth onto growth as long as it's done in a way that's proportional and meets the cost of providing that capacity to that particular growth. So in terms of the legal standard, how do we look at capacity charges and determine whether or not those standards and requirements have been met? The standard under Proposition 26 is that the agency must show by a preponderance of the evidence that you've met those requirements. And all that really means is that based off of your documentary evidence, it's more likely than not that you've met those requirements. It's more likely than not that the capacity charges represent the reasonable cost of providing service to those new connections. In other words, a proportional cost of capacity. And there's a number of methods that are used to establish capacity charges and to set forth that information. And some of the ones that are described in the American Water Works Association M1 manual include the buy-in methodology, which is a methodology that essentially values the existing system and figures out a proportional share of that system to put onto new development based off of the portion of that system that's going to serve new development. The second is the incremental cost method, which is based on the value or cost to expand the existing system's capacity, in which case you would take the proportional share of new facilities and put that onto new development through the capacity charge. Or finally, a combined approach that essentially has a buy-in component to the existing infrastructure as well as a component for expansion. So taking that all and whittling it into how do we have a legally sound methodology for establishing and adopting capacity charges, and what essentially the district has been doing and continues to do, is the first step is to determine what new or expanded facilities are required to accommodate new development. The second step is to identify the costs of those new or expanded facilities needed to accommodate new development. Third step is to take all of those costs and figure out what is a proportionate share to put onto new development versus what should be paid for by existing customers. And fourth is to identify the buy-in component of existing facilities allocated to new development and apportion the cost to capacity charges, whether that's by shifting a portion of existing debt service or all of existing debt service onto the capacity charges, or shifting other costs as appropriate onto the capacity charges. And with that, I will turn to.
Thank you, Luffy. Good afternoon, President Martin, members of the board.
So Luffy kind of sets up this really nicely here. I am going to now go over at least the methodology, getting through at least the first 3 steps here before turning it over to Wes, talking about how we determine new facility requirements there, and then starting to apportion the costs that would be put into a cap fee here. Okay, so the capital improvement program there, how is that set up? Well, that is set up through the district's master plan, and bear with me, I understand the board has seen these slides here at least a half dozen times over the last couple years or so, so I'm going to try to get through these fairly quickly here. So the master plan, this is the district's document here to help us anticipate and plan for growth here, and it also, of course, generates the capital improvement program. Now, the capital improvement program determines which capital facilities are necessary, and thus by extension the appropriate capital facility fees. So just as a reminder here, we have 3 different major components when it comes to setting up the capital improvement program. We have land use, which is what I'm about to talk about, then we have demand, and then design criteria. So as far as the land use, we obtain the land use from our jurisdictional agencies, the cities and the county of San Diego, which are within our jurisdiction. That basically presents the ultimate land use for the district. And we also utilize SANDAG's Series 12 population data for this master plan as well to estimate infill all the way through the next 20 years there, starting from 2015, and it goes through all the way through 2035. So the second portion here is the duty factors, which deals with our demands. So we have a lot of different ways to come up with our duty factors. We utilize a lot of materials, including our water meter records for this master plan that was used from 2008 to 2014. We also use, we have approximately 23 wastewater meters throughout our system. We compare the data between water and wastewater meters here to determine that the data looks kosher. In other words, you don't have wastewater flows in an area that drastically exceed a water demand. That would be a no-no. And then we also compare the duty factors to previous master plans as shown in this slide and the next slide. And what we're looking for, and we typically see here, is a smooth transition. Typically they're very consistent there, or we'll start to see a gradient one way or another. So that's the water, and then this is the sewer duty factors. So the ultimate demands, these are established utilizing both the duty factors as discussed previously, as well as the approved land uses from our jurisdictional agencies. We calculate demands on a parcel by parcel basis for every parcel within the district. This includes parcels that are currently developed there. For ultimate land use, we make the assumption that redevelopments of those properties can occur and would occur to the ultimate approved land use by the different agencies. We take all these demands, we total them together, and this represents our ultimate water and wastewater demands. What do we do for the next 20 years? We use the SANDAG population estimates. That gives us basically 5-year increments from 2015 all the way through 2035. And what this data does here is this gives us the demands, or translating to equivalent dwelling units, that are used to determine the capital facility fees, along, of course, with the revenue requirements for all these projects here that are identified in the capital improvement program. And of course, the CIP facilities, they're all sized to accommodate projected population growth. So how do we know how to size our facilities? Well, that's where our design criteria comes into play. These are very industry standard design criteria. For instance, a pipeline, we don't want our pipes there to exceed a velocity of 7 feet per second there, or else you start to see damage in your infrastructure. Very similar. On the wastewater side, we have design criteria for that. We have design criteria for pipelines, pump stations, lift stations, and reservoirs. And we take that design criteria, input it into our hydraulic models, and we can run different scenarios for different events here, such as existing demands, as well as future demand scenarios here. And our models can use this design criteria and identify when those design criteria are exceeded. So for each of these exceedances, we can go into the model, make a correction here, such as upsizing a pipe there, adding a little bit more capacity to a reservoir or a lift station, for instance. And so each of these changes that we make in the hydraulic model represents a capital improvement project. And that's how we came up with the 2018 master plans, water and wastewater capital improvement programs. And as you've seen many times before here, these are the different projects that were identified in the CIPs, which totaled, significant lineal feet of pipelines here, additional capacity in lift stations, and additional storage there in reservoirs, as well as a wastewater treatment capacity needs as well. And this is how the CIPs broke down between the different components here for a total cost of about $253 million in total identified infrastructure needs. Now, as Lupi was stating here in that final slide there, this is step 2. This basically identifies the cost for the entire program as identified. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the number that the capacity fee or the capital facility fee is based on, because the capital facility fee only takes the expansion portions of the CIPs. It basically separates out the replacement portions as well as any capacity deficiencies that would be funded by ratepayers. Another thing that's done here is the capital improvement programs. It removes basically projects that would be development specific. In other words, projects that don't have a regional benefit. They would only benefit like a set development here. Those projects are to be constructed by the developer. Also, phase 5 CIPs here, with the exception of the parallel land outfall and wastewater treatment, have also been removed from the listing here when it comes to determining the cap fees. So when you remove these here, the list gets actually quite a bit smaller. So on the water side, what you have here is about 9 different projects. The middle column being what's in the master plan as far as a projected capital cost. But then the next column over to the right is your expansion cost contribution. And then finally, your rightmost column here is that would be the fund or the expansion fund share as identified in the capital facility fee. And the water one's easier to read. The wastewater is a little bit larger list here, so not as easy to read. So going back to that slide that you saw just a couple slides ago, so instead of having a $253 million cost, your expansion fund contribution is really about $112.5 million. And so basically that's step 3, which is identifying the expansion portion of the CIP that would be utilized to help calculate the capacity fees. And so at this point here, I'm going to turn over to Wes here to talk about the other components that make up the capital facility fee.
Thank you.
Good evening, President Martin, members of the board. Rob's talked a lot about the CIP expansion costs and our growth estimates per SANDAG. Now I'm going to give a brief summary of the methodology used in calculating the capacity fee. So the district uses a growth or incremental methodology in calculating the capital facility fee. This methodology was developed for the district in 2012 by Atkins in their capital facility and impact fee study. In 2019, the district retained the Keys Group to provide an independent review and verify this methodology. And to quote from the Keys Group, the growth methodology is a common approach for establishing capital facility fees. And based on the cost of future capital facilities required to reasonably accommodate planned growth. lost my quote. And further, new and existing customers with increased demand pay for the incremental investment necessary for system expansion. So, what is the methodology? What makes up the fee? Well, in the numerator, we have the CIP expansion cost, which Rob talked about, plus the existing debt service and the existing shortfall. The existing debt and the existing shortfall both resulted from costs which have not been recovered through EDU collections to date. So if we estimate, so those were part of a previous capacity fee that have not been collected to date. So if we estimate that cost to be collected over 21,000 EDUs, for example, we may have only collected 11,000 so far. So there's still 10,000 EDUs in growth to be collected in the future, so it needs to be a portion of this capital facility fee. So that's the existing debt and the existing shortfall. They're both.
I have one question, Wes. The methodology developed by Atkins in 2012, was that verified by Keys in 2019 as the correct methodology?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what those quotes were supposed to be that I kind of stumbled on there a little bit, but basically they said, yes, it's a good methodology and expansion pays for expansion.
Thank you.
So that's the numerator portion of it. You have the CIP expansion cost plus the existing debt and existing shortfall. In the numerator, you have the growth projections in EDUs. So if you take the CIP expansion costs plus the existing debt and the existing shortfall, divided by the growth projections in EDUs, you get the proportional share or cost per EDU, which results in our capital facility fee. So that's really the methodology in a nutshell. I'm happy to answer any questions.
I see no questions.
All right, so they did save me a couple slides to kind of bring it home before we kind of open it back to the board. So staff has been working with council and been looking at some of the changes since the August 7th meeting. We've taken both public comment and internal comments into account. And what we've been doing is reviewing the CIP timing with associated growth. So everything that Rob just talked about, we're making sure that's been allocated correctly, that we're putting the proper amount of basically proportionate amount of growth is allocated correctly in the cap fee and the proper portions are allocated towards ratepayers. Existing system deficiencies has been addressed in the CIP, basically identifying and removing those from the cap fee. So if there's an existing deficiency in the system that wasn't caused by new development, then we're looking at where to allocate that properly. Verifying allocation of existing debt and shortfall, we're working right now on that, looking at making sure that we're verifying and doing it the correct way. And we're updating the study language for clarity. What we realize is everything's in the study language. The way it's written out, the way we're going through is good, but we're basically bringing it to the forefront so it makes it an easier document to read and understand. It's not changing the study, but it's definitely providing clarity for the study. With that, kind of as General Manager Prum indicated in the beginning, this is kind of capital facility fee schedule that we've worked out. So we have the workshop today. We're looking at completing revisions to the fees September 10th. We're looking at finalized revision of the study and then sending it out basically on the 20th, and then I'll be putting it on our website shortly after that. And then, of course, we're looking at bringing it back to the board for adoption October 2nd. And then new capital facility fees would take effect October 3rd. So with that, staff is available to answer any questions.
Any questions?
Yes, I do have
Yes.
a question.
Director Hernandez.
The round numbers, the 112 million capital improvement is being divided, if I recall correctly, up by about 6,600 EDUs. Am I got those numbers close?
Fairly close. So the 112,000 is primarily phase 1 through 4 projects, and depending on water or sewer, the number's more like 8,400 to 8,800 EDUs.
8,800.
Yeah. But there are portions like that Rob mentioned, like the parallel alpha and treatment that go on. That's a bigger denominator. It's a bigger number because that brings us out into phase 5.
Now, that 8,800 EDUs, is that what is being projected over the next 5 years or the next 25?
20.
20. So all of our capital infrastructure divided by all of our future growth is how we come up with the fee.
Within the phase, yes.
Right.
So if you're looking at a 20-year phase, you take that 20-year phase And if there's, let's say 8,000, just to keep numbers round, let's say there's 8,000 EDUs projected, those 8,000 EDUs, their proportionate share is the value that we're using. It's not the whole 112, because there's treatment's a big number out there. But, let's say, for example, water is, roughly 20 million plus, 22, 25 million, divided by 8,000 change. It's that, and then that's how you get the cap fee.
And I know we're not waiting, but I understand that the city of San Marcos is doing a new general plan, which I would anticipate is going to increase those densities and the number of EDUs. But I know we're in a snapshot here, and when would we look at a new snapshot?
So the city of San Marcos general plan and their housing element is actually, when we look at it with our projections, it lines up fairly well. I think they had roughly 4,000 and change EDUs in their housing element previous, and they're looking for another 3,000 and change. So over a 16-year period, and I know it's not the same period, they're looking at 7,400 EDUs based on my memory on their housing element. And kind of as we stated in the previous, at the August 7th board meeting, the timing of that may shift, but however, the EDUs will be there. And, we don't collect the fees if nobody develops, and we don't build the projects if nobody develops. So there's not a full self-adjusting to it, but there's some self-adjusting to it. So as long as the projects stay the same, and if the timing shifts, the projects still stay the same as long as you get those EDUs. So with what they've said, it feels at this point, it's too early to tell, that their projection and our master plan, or the Sandag numbers, are fairly close. But when they're done with it, we take a new look at it to see if it made a appreciable difference.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, we have a few speakers. And I think we're going to allow the speakers to 10 minutes to ask questions, if they have questions. And staff will be writing down the questions and have answers. It's not going to be a back and forth from dais to staff and staff to dais. Ask your questions and staff will answer them afterwards. First one is Michael McSweeney.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I know there were a few points that your staff made that I hadn't anticipated, and we spoke beforehand. Do I have adequate time to get everything answered?
You just ask the questions. They have to answer them.
All right, so first thing I want to make sure that the board understands. Yes, I'm Michael McSweeney, Senior Public Policy Advisor for the Building Industry Association. I represent people that build, developers. I want you to understand that I'm not here today to complain because developers don't want to pay fees. The discussion that we've been having with staff is there is a disagreement about how the fees, how they come to the fees, how they're calculated. So, I'm not here to complain, the fees are too high, the fees are too high. Remember, developers may write you the check, but whatever that fee is added to the cost of a house. We're in a housing crisis, we're exceedingly sensitive to any increases in cost. We heard from your attorney about the need for a nexus study and things like that. Yes, I agree with what he said, but when you look at what it is, especially on the sewer side, of a 72% increase, you can understand why we're demanding clarification and information. So with the information that I brought here, and Ann is making packets for you to spread, I wanted to explain just one. You're going to get one of these, which is a list of your sewer expansion projects. There's enough copies all the way to you, James and Wes. So if you look at the siphon for Section A, it says 100% of that expansion is attributable to new development. We had our engineers, you'll get this, which is an example of a project and where we disagree with the nexus or the background between what your staff has come up with. They're saying that new development is 100% responsible for this. The existing siphon Section A is a 20-inch, it's going to be made to a 24-inch section of line that serves an average flow of 7.5 million gallons a day. Using your data, this calculates to 30,000 EDUs using 250 gallons a day. And VWD indicates that actual EDUs as of 2014 are 37,646. The proposed new siphon section is a 30-inch pipe which has a capacity to build out, which your staff estimates to add an additional 27,600 EDUs. This is where we disagree. The current proposed fee is requiring the next 8,400 EDUs, what James just talked about, to fund 100% of this improvement that will have a capacity for at least 27,600 future EDUs. To be valid, the fee must demonstrate a reasonable relationship and proportional allocations of the estimated cost of the new facilities and new development that being asked to fund these facilities. So if you can go, what I'm reading from is this sheet here. And I'm all the way down to where it says cost impact. So if you look at the $22.9 million cost of this siphon divided by the 8,400 EDUs James talked about over the next 20 years, but that's going to add capacity well beyond 20 years. So when you look at the number of EDUs of additional capacity it brings to the district and you divide it, the cost per EDU drops by 75%. So these are the type of specific disagreements that we're having with district that we would like to get sorted out. So while the nexus study that you would have to do if this was for a development impact fee, the same threshold isn't there, we believe it's incumbent upon you as a policymaker, and I would tell you right now, if I was sitting in your shoes, I would want to have that information because the type of cost increase we're talking about here is going to severely impact people's ability to purchase houses, and it directly affects my customers and my members and their ability to bring projects forward. It's such a high number that we're convinced that it's really going to curtail development. So that's just one example. The other example I wanted to show you is here's building permit activity since 1980 in San Marcos, which is 80% of your district. And if you notice that in the year 1999 through 2005, you had a lot of activity. You put a lot of things in the ground. You made a lot of assumptions during that time for growth. And look what happened. Fell off the cliff. So hence, you end up with a shortfall. So while you may not have that legal requirement of a development impact fee, we think it's incumbent upon you to really look at this and sharpen the pencil because you're making a lot of assumptions. So when your staff talked about total demand and Rob talked about, we look at every property and every property, based on what the zoning is and every property is going to develop to its maximum potential. Mr. Chairman, you sat on the City Council for 2 or 3 terms. I bet you could tell me on one hand with fingers left over how many times that somebody developed to the maximum of the zoning. It really doesn't happen. So there's a lot of, I don't want to say fluff, but there's a lot of expansion in this demand that they're using to base their decisions on. You have a number of parcels which they're guesstimating based on what the underlying zoning is, 400 units. But it's the side of a hill. If it ever gets developed, you're looking at maybe 40. The argument they give back, and I have to give it to them, is look, we can only go by what the zoning says. But if you know going in, common sense tells you that, look, they're never going to build 400 houses there. We realize the standard we have to guesstimate from is 400. You have a lot of these small excesses all the way through this. And what you're asking people to pay for is something that will never happen. So when I show you this, and I want to talk about Meadowlark for a minute. You expanded that facility. I'm told, and I'm not an engineer, I don't play one on TV, so if I get something wrong, I'm hoping James will correct me. It's 5 million gallons a day of treatment. From that plant, you have a separate land outfall to Encina. It's my understanding that most of San Elijo Hills drains into that facility. You take that sewage, you turn it into reclamation water that you then sell to people. But during parts of the year when you have a lot of rainfall, you don't have as much demand. So it's my understanding that there's one of the lift stations or interceptor stations near San Marcos Boulevard where you can curtail some of the flows to that plant, and you send it down to Encina through the existing land outfall. Before we spend, a guesstimate of $55 million to put another pipe next to the pipe that's already there, which may or may not be needed in the next 20 years, it may not be needed for 50 years. I think we need to look at how much inflow and infiltration that pipeline gets during wet weather. Right now, I think you need to maximize Meadowlark to its full capacity and utilize that land outfall before you sink another $50-some million into a pipeline that may or may not be needed. When you looked at some of the design criteria, there's one specific thing that Rob mentioned, and he blew through it really fast, but your design criteria in your district is 7 feet per second. Most other districts, it's 8 feet per second. The city of San Diego is 10 feet per second. When you look at the need, especially for fire, it's not how many feet per second, it's pressure. So when you take always the most conservative approach, and your district has taken, as far as we can find, you're the only one that's at 7 feet per second. What that does is it adds more cost to the overall system. So what I would like to understand too, and when you put up, James put up his last graphic there about the timeline. So what I'm seeing is on the 20th of September, I'm going to get a finished report. I've got 2 weeks to look it over, share it with my membership, have it analyzed, and then be back here for a hearing on the 2nd of October. I don't know how you expect us, unless we get a copy of it sooner, to be able to analyze that stuff. We'd also like more specific on how some of these costs are estimated. We were told by staff that the $54 million cost for the outfall is based on an estimate that Escondido had when they were looking at building a new pipe from Escondido all the way to the coast. So I would think that prudence, you would want to have not just a guesstimate, but something that you could really hang your hat on. The other thing is, none of the other districts that are served by Encina are having the same types of conversations you all are having, and they're not coming to us with hey, we're going to update our cap fees and any type of gigantic increases. In fact, the Leucadia district, that general manager is looking to forestall any type of improvements to their system because they don't see the growth coming. So what I'm asking for tonight is, we want you to be able to vote on something. We want you to be able to vote on something that we think is defensible and is fair. And when we're looking at this now, we don't see either of those. I think there's too many variables at play, and what you're asking for is, I believe, excessive. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And do we have some?
Yeah, I think I could address at least several of them. I might need some help on a couple of them. So starting with the siphon A question, so I
Just
brought...
one thing I would like to clarify though is, how many meetings have you had with the EIA already?
Including talking about this in preparation with the master plan, maybe 6, maybe 7 total.
So they've been brought along. When they get this report on the 20th, it's just doing the methodology that we just explained again to them, and we're just going to place the numbers in it.
And we're going through those different items, as I mentioned right at the end, to make sure to address some of the things that Mr. McSweeney has brought up as far as proportionality, make sure the proper portions are placed. One of the things I like to point out is the Phase 5 CIPs, except for the outfall and the wastewater treatment. So that number is not getting divided by that 8,400. It's getting divided by the ultimate build-out number of 27,000. So that's already addressed. That's a misunderstanding or misconception. So staff has already looked at that, and that's kind of why we put it right here. It's a big number, and it's for ultimate development, and it's being divided by, just like treatment. So it's not being divided by 8,000 EDUs is what we're looking at that. And that's kind of the first thing with that $20 million siphon. Now, you have to remember that siphon is well more than 20 million, it's 50-something million dollars. Not all of it, sorry, the parallel outfall is a number that's in the $50 million range. But if you remember from, if you can find the CAF fee, if we look at the land outfall, $23 million of it is being apportioned to development. So the replacement portion of it for the existing is not coming from development fees. And since it is being ultimate, it's a Phase 5 projects. Phase 5 projects, which we only have 2, is not being divided by that 8,000. It's being divided by that much larger number. So I think those two things are the biggest issues with the outfall, which make up a big chunk of the fee, which will address the BIA and developer concerns. Let's see.
Can we get a clarification of what he's saying, so I can understand it? So when you said the 23 million of the 54 million, so is the cost impact I have here on what I handed out to you, that's 22,971, is that the $23 million you're talking about?
I believe so. I don't know. I got to double check the numbers, but it's close, yeah.
And my notes that I'm writing as you're speaking are, you're saying that your fee is based on that $23 million being divided by the total number of EDUs. And that, so what you're charging as part of your new fee is the 832, not the 2735?
Yes, that's what I was going to say. So this is not what the financing costs and present value information, but in general, the growth portion of the parallel outfall, which is not the full burden cost of the project, divided by what it's serving, which is Phase 5 growth. So not 8,000, the larger number.
So the 27,600.
So, and that's what we're looking at.
So of your new sewer fee that's 72% higher, basically 832 of that number.
No, what I'm saying is these are things that we're looking at to make sure it's properly proportioned in the September 20th report that we're coming out. So we're addressing those issues.
All right.
Okay. The next thing kind of that we went over is the max development zones. And Mr. McSweeney is correct. We don't have the right to change the land use, but just to be clear, a developer doesn't pay for max land use either. In other words, if a sorry, I know that there's some feedback here. If a developer comes in and he builds 10 units, even though 400 units is approved by land use, we don't charge him for 400 units. He pays for those 10 units. So again, and as that develops, in the land use, it's still there, and that's up to the land use agencies to do that. And when you look at the proportional costing of those projects, it makes very little difference. Could it make a pipe size difference in a project when you add it all up? Yes, but you also have to recall that when you build a project, and I'll get into the cost estimate, which is a little later, when you build a project, getting the project built is the most expensive portion. To make the pipe size one size bigger is really just a small proportion of the cost. So if we were to, let's say, do what Mr. McSweeney suggests, let's say, and kind of go out on a limb and say, this is what we think could be developed. Now, we could be challenged. We have no basis for that. This is not what staff is suggesting. What it would end up doing is reducing the EDUs significantly, potentially, but only reducing the project cost insignificantly. It would actually raise the fee. But we have no basis for that. We're not the land use agency. We're not going out there on the limb and trying to make land use up. So looking at apples to apples to apples, which is adopted land uses, adopted SANDAG, and standard policy, which are actual meter records. We're moving forward with that, and that's how we come up with our numbers. Is it conservative? Yes, but it's also defendable. And this is what, kind of, from a staff standpoint, it's easy to explain. The other question is metal art.
Mr. Chairman, James,
Mr. McSweeney?
he's answering a question that I didn't ask. And so, that, do you understand?
Ask the specific question. Ask specific, no sidebars, no little nasty notes. Just ask the question. So we can understand it.
We realize that whatever a project is.
That's not a question.
My question is if you're making the maximum assumption all the way along, knowing full well that the maximums will never be built, you're building in excess capacity. In your calculations, that eventually.
Okay, so your question to staff is, are you building in maximum? Is that your question?
Correct.
What's your answer?
The answer is yes. We're going based on the land use, and we're building per the land use, which is the maximum. However, from a timing standpoint, we're not doing that up front. We're pushed a lot of those maximums into Phase 5, which is not in the capacity fee. I want to be clear about that. Like infill projects, redevelopment projects, where we know there's existing homeowners there, it doesn't meet the land use, those are not in phase 1, 2, 4. It is pushed into phase 5. Phase 5 projects are not part of the fee. So the majority of that concern is really a moot point, because those projects are not. It's the vacant land is the only thing that's assumed to be maximum. The next question is regarding Meadowlark. So Meadowlark has a fail-safe line that is a pump line that can handle 2 million gallons a day average for pumping. We have basically a small pump system that pumps to the ocean outfall at Encina. It's not part of the land outfall system. It doesn't pump into to Encina for treatment. So the question is, we don't have the ability to just produce more recycled water when there's no recycled water demands, or the ability to use Meadowlark as the other line to put raw sewer into. You can't put raw sewer into that line because it completely bypasses Encina and goes straight to the ocean outfall, which means it has to be treated at Meadowlark to basically a secondary level which is fit for ocean disposal. The only pipe that we have that takes sewer from our system to Encina for treatment is our parallel land outfall. And with our parallel land outfall, kind of the first question that we kind of addressed for Mr. McSweeney, what we're looking at, that first section is a full parallel section. It's not an upsized section. We have an existing line, we're going to parallel it. As we go downstream, and it's 100% Vallecitos, as we go downstream, we have sections that we don't have a corridor. We can't parallel it, so we're going to rip out the old line and we're going to put in a larger line. That's why that $54 million job is not $54 million to development. It's actually 23 and changed for development, and then you add the obviously present value and financing costs, but from a costing standpoint. So Meadowlark can't handle those type of flows. Second off, we don't actually have the ability to pump that much, or we don't have the piping infrastructure. We'd have to build a brand new pipe to be able to convey those extra flows at that point, you're basically building a parallel outfall anyway. So we actually looked at that. We actually looked at storage of sewer right on San Marcos Boulevard to not pump. Those costs there's other issues with it, but they were actually more expensive too. So we looked at all those things on that. Yes.
So I have a quick question, James. If anyone else has a question, let me know. If development were to stop tomorrow, would we still need a parallel outfall?
No, we'd have to replace small portions of our outfall system.
Right.
But we would not need a parallel outfall.
There'd be no need to do it. Okay, that's the answer.
Go ahead, Rob, sorry.
Well, just one thing I wanted to talk about on the Meadowlark situation is the capacity for that plant there. That is discussed in the master plan in Chapter 7 here on how it is utilized for future, and how it does in the future. It is assumed to take peak flows off of the land outfall as is. If we didn't have that capacity at Meadowlark here, all of that flow would be going down the outfall here, and we'd have a bigger crisis than what's being implied there. So there is a capacity component to Meadowlark here that we do utilize here. So we do utilize it to its full capacity in that sense.
Actually, I guess a better question is, if we didn't have Meadowlark today, you'd need a parallel outfall today, but we don't. So,
James, let me jump in real quickly. I just want to clarify that the whole capacity fee is based on the master plan. The master plan was approved back in May, and that's the foundational document that we're using to calculate the fees. As far as I know, there were no challenges to the master plan document, and that's what we're using as the basis, and the basis of that was the land use, design criteria, and those types of things. So all these things build on each other. So some of the comments that Mr. McSweeney is making is taking us back pre-adoption of the master plan. So right now, staff is moving forward, basing it on the approved master plan.
and that's also with the cost estimate. So the BIA lawyer, Rutan, stated that he has no issues with the master plan or the costing of the master plan. We actually use existing costs of recent projects on a cost per linear foot for building projects, other agency costs, and just standard construction estimating. We use all three items combined to try and figure out what the cost estimates of our infrastructure were. Matter of fact, at the most parts, we end up having to up the budget when during a time like this where there's the cost escalation doesn't keep up with the standard indexes. Of course, during the recession, our estimates are high. But in general, throughout my career here, most of our estimates, unfortunately, are either right on or low. So from an estimate on what it's going to cost to build these things, much like I'm sure the housing industry is going through, their estimates are going up, so are ours. So this estimate we're comfortable with, and if I had any comment on it, I'd move it up if I could. Let's see, and as far as the EWA agencies, we're the only EWA agencies that's a growth agency. So all the other EWA agencies don't have any significant growth. I can't really comment to how their fees and infrastructure is made up. Some of them are actually much older than us and built out. We're a fairly young agency in the grand scheme of things, and we still have a significant amount of growth. That's about the only explanation I could give. And Rob, do you want to address those one on our design criteria?
Okay, so the design criteria here, Mr. McSweeney brought up the basis of our design criteria should be more tuned towards pressure instead of pipeline velocity. The answer is we use both. Both of those are components of our design criteria. It just so happens that the pressure that we have in our district is very good. So it's typically not the constricting criteria. Typically, it's pipeline velocity here. So that's one here that we find that we exceed a lot more than pressure criteria. We do set ours at 7 feet per second here. Yes, he has quoted some agencies such as the city of San Diego that might use some greater criteria. We use 7 feet per second here to help protect our system here. We don't want our infrastructure to see high velocities, which could damage it there. We feel like we got pretty good infrastructure here. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that.
I believe those were all Mr. McSweeney's questions.
Question.
Director Hernandez.
If we use, let's go to the top of the line, if we use 10 feet per second, what would that do to our overall design component?
It's in terms of like the capital improvement program?
Would it reduce the ultimate costs because we don't need as much infrastructure built?
If I'm just to take a stab at it here, would it make a difference here? It perhaps might make a slight difference, but I don't think that would make a significant difference.
Rob, turn off your microphone. Absolutely. So it would reduce some pipe sizes, but again, when you reduce the pipe size, you still are building a new pipe. There's an incremental cost difference for the material. It's still the same construction, so it makes a slight difference.
So we're cautioning on the side of safety for our folks?
Yes, and the city of San Diego is not the pillar example that we want to use for our infrastructure maintenance. So.
General Manager?
I heard one thing Mr. McSweeney say, it may not have been a question, it's more of a comment, and he talked about the timing. So if the report's not released until September 20th and the hearing's on October 2nd, I believe he's put in a soft request there for additional time.
I don't know how much it's going to change. If the changes are easily understood, if there's one thing I hope you gather tonight is we've had a number of discussions with staff, and I'm still sitting here scratching my head. My members are still scratching their heads. They come up.
Okay.
My engineer is the one that provided the example written down. So you understand how. We can't reconcile this. If we could reconcile it, and what they're saying is, we might not like it, but if we say, this is right, we might not like it, we're not going to oppose it, because it's right. That's why there's a disconnect. And, I can tell you standing here 5 years later, this district is 100% better to work with than 5 years ago. And I appreciate that. My members appreciate that. You got a good GM, you got good people. I enjoy working with them. It's just that we can't get our head wrapped around this. We can't get it to where our guys are saying it pencil out. So if there's changes that are easily understood, 2 weeks might be enough time. If not, I'm at a disadvantage. And when we looked at the master plan, we looked at these things, it didn't look like we were gonna be at where we are today.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McSweeney. I think that the important thing on the timeline is, in my opinion, there's probably some projects that want us to delay it another 2 or 3 months, so they don't have to pay the fees. But all that would do is increase the fees for everyone else. So there's no reason, they've had 6 meetings, I don't see any reason to change that date as set. I was hoping we'd do it tonight, actually, but doing to a preponderance of making sure we're correct, we're holding off.
You know, by law, Ludwig can correct me if I'm right, you're only required to publish the data 10 days before the meeting, and that's what's going to be done, is the new and adjusted data will be presented. As you've said, this is at least the 3rd time around the mulberry bush relative to this, and I think what's been done has addressed many of the concerns raised by Mr. McSweeney relative to, A, the allocation to new development, B, how those EDUs are factored in, and it addresses those. I don't think this is, as Jim Prum indicated, this isn't the time to debate the master plan study that was already approved, and that's what these numbers are based on, and in part that's what Mr. McSweeney's criticisms were to already approved master plan projects.
Okay, we have another speaker, Mr. Jim Simmons.
Mr. President, board members, my name is Jim Simmons. My office is at 160 Industrial Street, San Marcos. And we've been working at this for a long time, over a number of years, really. And I do appreciate the fact that the staff is relying on a master plan that was approved. And we're looking at that data pretty carefully as to whether or not we think the conservative approach that they have used is justified over the long run. Obviously, we're going to have comments about that, feedback to you guys on that. Our objective is not to undermine your ability to try to provide service to people that need it, and our customers need it. Our objective is to make sure that it is as equitable and fairly applied as possible. We have several projects that are in the pipeline. I have a project that's been in the pipeline for 34 years. It's actually going to get built. If this fee is implemented now, that puts that project in jeopardy. And I know you're going to say, oh, it's another $10,000. Well, it's a lot. So when you have 187 units. So we'd like to get some feedback from the board as to how projects that are ready to go to grading are financed, are going to be dealt with in the application of this process. There hasn't been any discussion of that. We're not happy with some of the numbers your staff has used. We're going to reevaluate the final report. We'll come back to you with some feedback on that. And I think that, you look at the water side, and the funny part of it is you also look at the sewer side. And that's pretty much what a lot of my clients are looking at doing if this fee goes in. So we're trying to figure out how to make it equitable, make it fair as we move into the process. And another interesting number that I haven't been able to get a handle on is what's the difference between your wet water flows or wet weather flows and your dry weather flows. I would like to know what that number is, what the average flows are based on wet and dry flows. That would help a lot in terms of gaining an understanding of how much of this system is being used to handle that and how much of that is a maintenance issue versus an expansion issue. So that'll be helpful if we can know that before we come back on the 2nd of October. We do take this seriously. We understand the dilemma that you guys are in. We appreciate the fact that your staff's worked very hard to do this, to get the information you need. We would like them not to be as conservative as they are, but we don't want them to underestimate the process either. So we don't want to end up in a situation 5 years from now where we have a moratorium because we don't have service. So it is a dilemma that we're working very hard to fix, and we're not pointing fingers at anybody saying it's wrong. What we're saying is, we just have to get comfortable with those numbers and try to figure out how to implement the process in a way where projects that are already financed, ready to go in the ground, don't get killed. I have to go back to the bank and tell them we just added $10,000 to the financing. Well, in our case, that's $2 million. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but it is. It's a ton. So let's be careful about how we do that. Please give us some feedback as to how this is going to work in terms of projects that are ready to go and how we are going to deal with some of these other issues. The wet weather flows are important for us to know. If somebody could give me an answer on that, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure. Starting with Mr. Simmons' last question, so the wet weather flows compared to the average flows are actually located in the master plan. Rob, can you let him know the chapters or sections?
Yeah, that's chapter 7 of the master plan, which goes over the wastewater infrastructure. If you want here, I'll try to find exactly.
No, you don't have to.
Yeah, it's in chapter 7 though.
Yeah. So, as far as the projects, as far as final entitlements and annexation, so obviously what we're looking at is the projects have to be part of the district. If they're not in the district, we can't collect fees from them. That's pretty obvious. And they have to have a certain level of entitlements. And we're still kind of working internally to figure out where that is to make it fair and equitable, that they could come in and pay fees. But if they're not an entitled project or they're not in the district, we really can't collect fees. And there's also a risk on the development side as the fees are non-refundable.
Okay, so that's our policy, the board's policy on fees?
Yep.
Is,
They're non-refundable.
we changed them for Mr. McSweeney, I do believe. We're the only water district that changed them for Mr. McSweeney. That now they have to pay the fees on.
We collect the fees upon certificate of occupancy.
Yep.
Right,
So-
CO,
Right.
rather than when they come to build.
Right. Before, it was at approval of the project, and delaying it till occupancy could add 2 years, a deferral of 2 years, and that was at the request of the BIA.
Right.
And the board granted that request. Now, back to the original comment, and they could pay early. If they don't, that's the latest they can pay. If they
Right.
wanted to pay early, they could, and whoever pays would pay the fee in place at the time that they pay the fee.
Right.
So if they had an entitled project that was already annexed to the district, they can come in tomorrow and pay the fee. But if they don't, then they have to get to that level.
Okay, so entitled and annexed.
Yep.
That's the policy, okay? I'm sorry, Mr. Simmons?
Yeah, I'm talking about Sandwich Highlands.
Yep.
And that project goes to LAFCO on October 7th. That'd be a real tragedy to have this go into effect on October 2nd and end up having to pay $2 million more 5 days later. Thank you.
What? Question?
Director Hernandez?
If I heard us correctly, if the report comes in and we in fact do implement identify the fees on October 2nd, don't I remember that we're getting them implemented 30 days later, or?
No.
It's their discretion.
Yeah, so it's the board's discretion. Our attorneys have informed us that there's not a mandatory 60 or 30-day delay. You can make the new updated fee effective immediately. So if the board took action on October 2nd, then if somebody came in October 3rd, we could have the fee effective October 3rd. That doesn't mean it has to be effective the next day. That's the board's discretion.
Yeah, and
Director Snella?
And Director Hernandez, you're right, and you're remembering of our conversation. We did have a discussion, although we did not make a final decision, that just good business in general, that you don't make a significant change to anything without giving some sort of proper notification, be that be 30 days, 60 days, whatever it might be. So we did have a conversation about that.
Thank you.
Not just water district business, but any business.
Director Evans?
Thank you. I did want to reiterate what actually Mike just said, is that we are listening, and our staff is listening, and that option is always in front of us. I don't think any of us are adamant at the time. I think we'll see what comes forward and what we feel is just and equitable after we see the results on the 20th. I did have a question for you, Rob. Just out of curiosity, did you by any chance look up what the difference between the wet and the dry flow is. And I'm going to plead ignorant here because I don't know how this would impact this. I don't understand how it impacts.
I share your last statement here. I have a variety of dates I could give you the flow difference, but let me just start with the ultimate. Ultimate, we're projecting a peak wet weather flow of 31.7 million gallons a day and a peak dry weather flow of 20.2 million gallons today. So it's approximately 11.5 million gallon difference between the numbers. As kind of you stated in your last statement here, I don't know exactly what the intent of that is here. I know if Mr. Simmons is concerned about certain developments there and what the dry weather flow is here, Mr. Simmons can request a study from us on that. We've done many of those in the past. We do wet weather typically here. If he wants dry weather flows, we can certainly do it. The only thing is I don't know what dry flows get us because we do not size our infrastructure for dry weather flows. We size our infrastructure for the worst case scenario, which is a peak wet weather flow, like we saw last year's rain event on Valentine's Day and also saw during the 2010 December rain event.
And thank you. So my question was, and I think what he had said, and it confused me as he said, what does the difference have to do between maintenance issues and expansion issues? When he was implying that, because I do know our policy is to handle the worst, so.
So at the last board meeting, that the board did go ahead and adopt or look at or certify, I forgot what the action was, basically our sewer maintenance, I forgot the name of it right now, I just blanked. SSMP, thank you.
Sanitary sewer maintenance program.
Thank you. And that kind of outlines what we're required to do for sewer maintenance, which is the videoing, the cleaning, identifying inflow, or, I&I, inflow and infiltration in the system. This may have, and I'm guessing, have to do with, do we have a lot of inflow and infiltration that's above a normal amount as far as from an industry? That is the reason we're sizing the pipes so big is because of that I&I. And the answer is no. Our I&I is actually well within industry standards. We meet our SSMP or exceed it every year. We have projects that we identify that the board actually approves through the budget process and also through the construction process for taking care of trouble spots. And that's part of our ongoing asset maintenance, basically. And in general, we have I&I throughout our system, just like any other agency. And when we have new pipes with new developments, the I&I is a little bit less. And then over time, we get more and more I&I in the system, whether it's illegal connections or something that's broken, or what have you. And so our I&I number will change over time. But what we've discovered with the reduction of water use is that the peak has separated out. So our average came down, but the peak stayed where it is. So what we're seeing is, people still get up and take showers at the same time. Maybe they lose a little less water in a day, but we're seeing our peaks kind of go up from there, and we kind of looked at that in this master plan.
Thank you, that helped.
No other questions? One more speaker, Ms. Hunsaker.
Mike Hunsaker again, San Marcos. I share some of the BIA's interest in having a greater nexus. My concern is that there is insufficient buy-in for existing capacity that has been paid for years ago for present development. I particularly am very interested in the interceptor, San Marcos interceptor. I'm interested in the reservoirs and how are those being accounted for in the present fees. Now they're talking about capturing precisely how much capacity that each development needs. Well, I'm for that too, but it has to be a totally transparent transaction.
Excuse me, Ms. Hunsaker, I'm just writing it down here. Is there sufficient capacity? Is that your first question?
The question is, well, I haven't gotten into the sufficient capacity yet. I'm saying that I agree with that, and there should be a buy-in, but in order to have a buy-in, there has to be sufficient capacity. Now, the 2015 Urban Master Water Plan does not show how the future water capacity is to be generated. How can that be included in the present capacity fees? If you're already in a deficit, why isn't these costs included? And the existing capacity, why are we not having buy-in for these past investments made by the existing ratepayers and ongoing ratepayers for this future development? I direct for Best and Krieger's attention the case of the Davia Village Apartments. There is a distinct development, 416 apartments plus some commercial. There are figures that you're basing your master water plan on that show that there should be 10 apartments for every 2-inch meter. So the EDUs figure out to about 42 meters, about 300, 400 EDUs total. But there was only 11 2-inch meters purchased. So the EDUs figured in your projections and the water capacity figures do not match. There's also a water supply assessment that was done for the development, which gets into the specifics. And it uses the averages, but this development is always on the high side. So the EDU figures and the water consumption figures do not tally, and there is no latitude for how this new water is to be done. It appears, and the BIA has been promoting this for some years, is to do some water reclamation at the WA, and that this would manage to help us. Well, how do we get that paid? If we allow these developments to go without paying anything for the capacity that you already indicate needs to be built? How do you develop any sort of plan where the water assessment doesn't match the ordinances on how many meters should be bought and how many EDUs match up with that? So that is something that is going to have to be addressed in the legal area as well as the practical area. As far as Prop 218, I think that does matter. You cannot charge existing ratepayers extra because of deficiency in capacity fees. There is two bounds. You cannot ask the developers to pay more than is required, and you can't ask the ratepayers to pay more than they need to do. So how you balance this? Well, there needs to be a far greater accountability. There needs to be far more precision in the buy-in, and you need to look at the facility fees they did pay and come up with some explanation as to why there are more credits for waste treatment than there is for water consumption. How does that happen? There is a systematic underpayment for both wastewater treatment and water supply in the master water plan, which is not with any explanation. The outfall capacity and capacity of waste treatment is indeed going to be a big issue. Ms. Evans has brought that up. BIA has brought it up, and I'm going to bring it up. We do not have enough capacity, period, now. And I asked staff how it treats the raw sewage that's pumped to Encina to levels where it can go into the ocean. Where does Encina have the capacity? By the capacity extras, the peaking factor for wet weather that you have a waste treatment peaking of slightly over 2. And this is fairly universal across the counties where I've spot checked. Well, if Encina is running around 62% capacity and has a peaking of 120%, where does the wastewater go? Does it go into the ocean? Yeah, untreated. That's the issue. How do you treat that? And how do you get all that fecal matter and bacteria taken care of? The SSO reports say that it did get into the ocean. And the question is also, the peaking factor that is there is based on one 2010 incident. That had a moderate rain of 3.24 inches. And that produces crisis throughout the system. But the outfall has to have, supposedly, a capacity equal to a 100-year rainstorm. A 100-year rainstorm is 6 inches overnight, essentially, preceded by several different smaller rainstorms that are soaked up and saturate the soil. Well, if you start using something other than a drought-driven moderate rain as a criteria, you are seriously underestimating how much you need. And that really affects what you're going to do with any water reclamation or recycling plan, especially with very questionable water storage. I think the existing ratepayers have not been well served by the delay that has been done in getting new cap fees. And we're paying the price on all sides, and this is going to be a point of major controversy. One of the other things that needs to be done, and which is not done, is in the pipe capacity calculations. You have a velocity limit which applies if you have sufficient pumping capacity to increase the pressure to get the fluid through. If you're dealing with a fixed head, it's not the square of the pipe diameter, it's the 2.5 to the exponent, which increases the pipe size. I'm asking that we do give everyone a fair shake. And as far as affordability, we have affordability crisis, and I agree absolutely with Director Martin, and I'm wrapping it up, that we can't charge existing ratepayers more. That's unfair. Thank you.
We're going to have staff respond, but first, we happen to have the president of EWA on our board, and I'm sure he'd like to respond to your allegations. Mr. Hernandez.
I have no idea where you got your information. It's unequivocally, absolutely false. We have never, I repeat, never in the 10 years I've been on, and I've been told by the board the years before, have never put a drop of sewage into our ocean. It has been cleaned. We have increased the cleaning based on the state requirements. Absolutely, unequivocally, never, I repeat again, never put a drop of untreated sewage into our ocean. You can take that to the bank. So I don't know where you got it for information, but you need to check it before you deliver it to me anyway.
And that's just one of many things that were said that were incorrect. hopefully just
I'll-
mistakenly incorrect,
I'll
not
take-
outright lies.
I'll take a shot on a few, and then I'll turn it over to James and
Okay.
Rob, and I'm going to jump on the Hernandez bandwagon there. I think the data is being misinterpreted. EWA, when they look at the capacity of the plant, that it includes wet weather. So when we're at 62%, that includes the wet weather flows that come in. So artificially doubling it, as Mr. Hunsaker did, to say it's 120% of capacity, absolutely taken out of context and incorrect. Mr. Hunsaker did say something about Prop 218, and Rob, if you can bring up slide 8. I want to refer to what Lutfi said earlier. If you look at the first sub-bullet on slide 8, when that's brought in, I agree with Mr. Hunsaker. And this is where our Lutfi said that it's fair that the public not be charged for a burden on the public infrastructure and vice versa. We can't have the public pick up development and development shouldn't pick up that which was on the developer. That was the whole point of the slides that we showed on information we showed on slides 24 and 25 when we broke down the overall cost and showed what was really being put on the developer. It's not 100% and it's not zero in most cases. It's somewhere in between. And that somewhere in between was based on an analysis of how much should be placed on the backs of the developers and how much should be placed on the existing ratepayers. Mr. Hunsaker talked about the need to buy in. If you bring up slide 9, that's what Lutfi was talking about right there. There is a buy-in cost. And you can maybe then turn to slide 28. That's what we're doing. When you look at taking the existing debt and the existing shortfall and placing a portion of that, the appropriate portion, on the developer, that is the buy-in. Those are costs that we've already incurred for facilities that have already been built that they're going to get the advantage of. So they should pay a portion of that. So that is the effective buy-in. Plus, so you look at that bullet says what makes up the fee. The two bottom sub-bullets, the existing debt and the existing shortfall, is the buy-in, and the CIP expansion cost is the new facilities they need on top of what has already been built. So we feel staff has done the appropriate job to look at all those components to move it forward. The nexus needs to be established. That's the whole point of what we're doing. That's been the result of some of the delay, is to make sure that we have the appropriate nexus, that we're showing the connection between development and the facilities and the cost thereof that should be placed on that development. So I'll turn it over to James and he can cover anything that I missed.
So I think General Manager Prum stole most of my thunder on this one, but I'll just kind of add on. So obviously what we kind of said is since the August 7th meeting, we are looking at that proportionate appropriation for debt and shortfall, making sure we put the right amount on developers and the right amount on existing ratepayers to make sure it's proportioned fairly. So we are looking at that. And the good news is this: we don't have a tremendous amount of projects that we have debt on, and they're mainly larger future growth projects. So it's going to be fairly straightforward, and just figuring out how to apply it correctly. So projects like the 40 million gallon tank, Metal Arc expansion, and Encina Phase 5 expansion, those are growth projects that aren't fully utilized. That means we made room for future development and we have debt associated with it. So we're just trying to figure out to make sure we do it right to get the right amount. We don't have a lot of little projects that are already built, completed, done, and we're trying to collect debt on from new developers. That's not the case here. Along with the outfall treatment question that Mr. Hunsaker said, I think Mr. Prum's explanation is valid. I think there's just a misunderstanding. When you look at sewer capacity, you're looking at average flows. When you talk about a treatment capacity at Encina, if Encina is a 20-something MGD treatment plant, that's based on the average flow. But when you design the facilities, just like when we design our pipes for peak wet weather, for that rush hour traffic, so to speak, of water or sewer, Encina builds their facilities for that peak wet weather. They don't say that we have the ability to treat 100 million gallons a day of sewer or whatever that peak number actually is, but they size their basins, they size their infrastructure to hold that. They have a load equalization tank that helps moderate that flow. The actual sewer, you didn't actually add on a peak. If your peak goes up 2 or 3 times, there's not 2 or 3 times more fecal matter in that sewer. It's 2 or 3 times more water mixed with that fecal matter. So the treatment system is still treating a standard of raw sewer of, for us, 6.5 MGD or 62% of Encina for Encina. but the basins, the sizing of the system, it's built in. And the cost of Encina is associated with that. They had to build those basins to handle that peak wet weather. And all the member agencies of Encina pay for that. So I think it's just a misunderstanding. When you look at a sewer treatment plant, it's the permitted size, and that's based on average flow. But the peak flow is built in, just as General Manager Prum stated. Along with that, we kind of went into some of the other things with, help me out, Rob. What was a couple of the bottom questions here? Yep. Oh, okay, so I'll have Rob, I'll start on the 2010 incident and also the Davia Village item. First off, just what Davia Village, remember, a unit is not an EDU. That's the first thing. And not to take too much of Rob's thunder here. Also, if the land has additional EDUs already purchased on it from previous, that counts. We can't charge them for capacity already allocated to that land. So if they have a certain amount of meters on site, they get credit for those meters. The developer doesn't pay twice for it. As far as the peak weather 2010, that's a lot of rain. Now you have to remember, we don't have storm drains. Storm drains, you have to take into consideration that big rain event. With sewers, the rain events, the bigger rain events, you're going to get more, but at some point, more won't fit in. The holes aren't bigger. We're not collecting all of it. Most of it's going to run off and go into the streams. I'm not talking sewer, water falling from the sky, going to run off and go into the streams. So sizing a sewer event for a 100-year rain event, basically putting a standard of storm drains to sewer is inappropriate, because every sewer down the street, or not every sewer, but a lot of sewers down the street would be these humongous pipes that take up half the street. It's not a practical, and if Mike McSweeney of the BIA is complaining about our conservative estimates now, if we did that, I would have to be on his side complaining right along with him. So, Rob, with that, why don't you go on maybe the rain event, because that's kind of a short one, and get into the Davia Village.
Thank you, Mr. Gompel. I think you hit the 2010 rain event very satisfactory, very excellently, if I could actually say so. Little more information here on Davia Village. If the board recalls, when we were going through the master plan, addressing comments from the program EIR that we received from the public, as part of our thrilling 71 slide presentation that we gave to the board here, Davia Village was addressed as part of that there. So the Davia Village here, they have purchased 12 2-inch meters from us, not 11. They've also purchased 4 irrigation meters, and like Mr. Gumpel says, they had existing capacity already allocated to the property that the previous owner had purchased many years ago. So when we added all of that up, we got to a capacity point where, as a staff, we were comfortable that they had sufficient capacity for what their demands were projected to be. We felt that was reasonable. Now, that's not to say that in the future, if we go back through the records and we find out that their actual usage is severely exceeding capacity, we have the right to go back and charge them additional capacity here. That's the beauty of that. The other issue I wanted to hit real quick here was the 2015 Urban Water Management Plan deficiency, which just continues to come up here and get misrepresented. So the 2015 Urban Water Management Plan does not show a supply deficiency here. The table here that and we've seen also from Latham and Watkins and other groups in the past here is that there is a demand shown here, and there's also a supply shown here, and what it's showing is the demand is severely deficient. The problem is the number is showing there, and this is per the state Department of Water Resources here, that's considering a conservationless number. That is not taking into account the conservation that the members, our ratepayers, have been doing for years on end. When you take that conservation that they're already doing into account, what you'll find is that we are well under our capacity assumptions by our wholesaler, the San Diego County Water Authority. We were in 2015. We're still well under it today, and at the rate that we're growing since 2015, we're still going to be well underneath that supply by 2020, when we will redo the urban water management plan. And I got a feeling here just how that all came out there in the papers and all that, that the state's going to have a little bit of a different take on how to put those numbers together. But one more thing to keep in mind here, the state came back to us, they read our urban water management plan, they came back to us, and they had 0 comments on our urban water management plan. I'll conclude with staff is very open to meeting with all members of the public here. I mean, we've talked about meeting with the BIA here. If Mr. Hunsaker would like to meet with us here, we would love to go over some of these issues with him, and maybe perhaps we can correct some of these misunderstandings. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want the record to reflect, because I understand and I want development to pay their fair share, but the misinformation that I believe purposely is being put out there to confuse the public is unfortunate and not helping. You were extremely patient going through that, Rob, because I know for a fact, because I've been here, that Mr. Hunsaker's brought these issues up at least 3, probably more like 5 or 6 times in previous meetings over the last year, and has had these answered 5 or 6 times. And to continue to come up here and spread what are outright lies is just not helpful, Mike. Okay, are you?
I'll give you a couple of presentations in the future.
Great, thank you. Thank you. And thank you for your patience and your explanation.
Director Hernandez?
And you brought up the meetings, and one of the things that we specifically have not discussed is the transparency that the letter that was delivered to us brought to attention. And I want the public here, and of course anyone that happens to be watching, we meet, as just was spoken, with anybody that wants to come and talk about any of our policies, any of our positions, but we're not going to do it in a public forum every time. There is nothing going on. We've met with the BIA because we want to make sure that all of the items are addressed and to make sure we are on the right path. But this lack of transparency is just false. False, false. Thank you.
And unless we have one more speaker, Marlene Waldron. Sorry, bad eyesight. Should have my glasses on. I brought them. That was amazing.
Thank you. I like what I heard tonight, and I'm sure you've heard many of the same comments as you said. But one thing I wanted to make clear, just because a sewer line isn't quite to capacity yet, San Diego has allowed the city to add houses to the, not houses, but mother-in-law houses or a rental unit to the properties which exist. And that will cause the sewer to reach maximum in a shorter time than anticipated if many of the people go in to do that. The other thing is, if we don't put in the bigger sewer lines now, it's going to cost us a lot more later. True, I don't think builders should have to pay the whole thing, but someone has to, and it usually falls onto the builders. I lived in Israel for a while, and their sewers reached maximum capacity. Then some of the lines broke, and they hadn't even built out yet. The sewers became on top of the roads, and they go across the streets, and 20 years later, they're still there because it's almost impossible to dig up the streets 20 years later to put sewer lines in under a lot of the houses that have since been built. And so this lovely eyesore of sewer system above ground, which is now getting outdated also, is a problem. So I commend you guys in thinking of ahead and putting in the larger sewer line now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, and good point about the Granny Flats.
Okay. Anyone else? I would like to thank our staff and thank the BIA, thank Jim Simmons, thank everyone for attending, the good doctor for attending. I think staff has answered these questions many, many times, and it's not really changing. At the last meeting, we decided to go look at the methodology and make sure that we were 100% on line with it. And you're right, a date hasn't been set for implementation, but it could be set as quickly as if the board so decides. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and to add on to the transparency, this board is so transparent, this staff is so transparent. Anyone who can pick up the phone and talk to Glenn, and he'll answer any questions you have or send the other person that would be more helpful to you. I mean, we're as transparent, I mean, we're your neighbors. You have to remember that we're your neighbors, we represent you. You know, we don't represent staff, we represent you in making sure that everything's done correctly as best as we see. So with all that, I'd like to thank you all very much, and.
Any more comments or no? You gonna shut us down?
Are there more comments to be made? I asked before I spoke.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I went,
Oh, I didn't know that's what that meant.
okay, Mr. Sinella, do you have something you want to say?
I just, again, I withheld a lot of my comments along the way because I wanted to hear what everybody had to say. And I too want to thank staff for putting this together, and everybody from the development community to the residential community who came out today to participate. I wish there was more people here. It's unfortunate that there's not. We have developer capacity fees in place currently. They're roughly around $17,000 per unit that's built. The initial proposal that came out, as Mr. McSweeney had mentioned, for part of those fees was going to be a 72% increase. If you got an electric bill, a cable bill, a phone bill, or any other bill that happened to be 72% more, you would ask a question. What's going on, right? I think that's normal, and I think it's normal for the development community to ask that question. We have a team internally, and we're getting outside legal opinion, and we're getting outside other opinions from experts around what method to use to determine the correct amount to charge developers. There's definitely going to be a fee. There most likely will be an increase. How much that increase will be is yet to be determined. But for us up here, we just want to come up with the correct information. We have people, everybody who's at least spoken tonight has some sort of vested interest. Either they're in the development community, they want to stop growth completely, they're a disgruntled former employee. There's a lot of different, reasons why people are coming forward and trying to get into this conversation. The important thing for us is that the fees are correct and that we're charging development, for the new infrastructure that's needed to support their development. And when that number comes in on September 20th, we'll have, better data to look at. But as a board, it's kind of we're caught in the crosshairs here as like the judges, if you will. We're getting ample subject matter expert, opinion in this area to make this decision, both internally and externally from third parties, and I think that's important to mention.
Director Hernandez.
Oh, no, I'm good.
Director Evans.
I would like to say thank you to everyone for your input, and I do want to compliment staff on the presentation, and I want to compliment the audience on their questions and presentations. It's easy to get misunderstandings. It's also easy to see it from only one angle, and as the board has already expressed, it's very difficult to sit up here and realize that the ratepayers today and the builders today are still going to be paying what needs to be done to maintain a system that indeed provides you the quantity and quality of water you want whenever you need it, and manages to take your waste away whenever you need it. We don't worry about a rainy day means you can't use water at all, and we don't worry about I'm having a giant party so I can't flush my toilets. If you take it down to the basic core of it, it's very, very difficult to take this big picture and try to guesstimate what the future is. And that's why staff has spent so much time finding Sandag and other organizations and master plans, so we can say to you, this is what we're using as our formula. That's the only way you can do it. It's no different than your own budget at home. You have to figure out how to pay the costs. And I think as a ratepayer, I feel we're in an incredibly well-run, managed water district. I didn't know that until I got on here and got to see the details. It's a very difficult position. So I really appreciate any input, and I agree with this board that it's very serious. We want to do what's fair and equitable, and in that process, we will come up with the best answer, but we're going to rely on numbers, not guesstimates, and not maybes and ifs. Just, we have to find somewhere to start. So I just want to thank everyone.
Okay, well, with that, the 2 days I understand that you have to plan for in the sewer industry is you have to plan on halftime at the Super Bowl. Everyone uses the facilities. And in the middle of the night when there's an earthquake, everyone wakes up and uses the facilities. So you have to be ready for that capacity at all times. Otherwise, you get a real problem in your streets, as brought up by Marlene. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Adjourned.